Ethan woke up to the blaring sound of his alarm clock, his body aching in a way that felt oddly familiar yet entirely wrong. He groggily opened his eyes, expecting to see the master bedroom he shared with his wife, Lily, the sterile white walls of their house, and maybe even the muffled sounds of their kids playing downstairs. Instead, he was greeted by a cramped, messy bedroom he hadn't seen in decades, his teenage bedroom. His breath caught. He bolted upright and looked around, heart pounding. The faded posters of basketball players, the cluttered desk with old school books, and the creaky bed frame, it was all the same. This can't be real, he muttered, rubbing his face. He glanced at the calendar on the wall, March 18, 2003. He let out a hollow laugh. Rebirth. A second chance. But instead of joy, an overwhelming wave of bitterness washed over him. Memories of his previous life flooded in, sharp and relentless. His marriage with Lily had been painful. Not in the conventional sense. She wasn't unfaithful or disrespectful. She was loyal, disciplined, and supportive in her own way. But she never loved him the way he loved her. Never. Every moment he spent doting on her, sacrificing his dreams to see hers fulfilled, and being the best husband and father he could be, felt hollow in hindsight. She never said "I love you," never held his hand unless he initiated, never looked at him like he was her world, even though she was his. He'd thought marrying her would change things. Then having kids would. Then decades together might. None of it did. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had lived a life where he poured every ounce of himself into a woman who, despite being his wife, had never reciprocated his love in a way that felt real. Never again. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, staring at his younger reflection in the mirror. The face staring back at him wasn't hardened by years of disappointment. It was soft, eager, naive. His hands curled into fists. Not this time. Lily. Even now, the thought of her made his heart ache. Her sharp wit, her beauty, the way she always seemed untouchable. He loved her still, more than he should, but this time, he wouldn't let that love destroy him. "I won't be a simp," he whispered to himself, voice trembling. "If she doesn't care, then I won't either." He knew it wasn't entirely true. Deep down, he'd always care. But he'd be damned if he spent another lifetime groveling for scraps of affection. This time, he'd focus on himself. His career, his growth, his dreams. And if she noticed him? If she cared? That would be her decision to make. But he wouldn't chase her anymore. Ethan's mind raced with the possibilities. He was 16 again, with all the knowledge of his past life. He could change everything. He remembered businesses that boomed, stocks that skyrocketed, and trends that would shape the future. He pulled out a notebook and started scribbling furiously. Bitcoin, he remembered how his past self had laughed it off as a scam. This time, he'd invest early. Amazon and Google, two names that had seemed insignificant but turned into titans of the industry. Skills and education, he wouldn't waste time on useless hobbies. Coding, languages, finance, these would be his new focus. Ethan's lips curled into a grim smile. He would rise higher than anyone could imagine, not for her, but for himself. He'd become someone so far out of Lily's league that even she would have to acknowledge his worth. But a small part of him, the part that still held onto the love he felt for her, wondered if it was even possible to escape her shadow. The sharp morning sunlight streamed through the window of Ethan's childhood bedroom, a stark contrast to the last days of his past life. This time, he wasn't going to waste his time or energy on chasing after someone who didn't seem to care. He sat at his desk, flipping through his old school books. Math, science, history, he now saw these subjects through the lens of opportunity. His memories of the future were vivid, market trends, promising stocks, and the tech boom that had shaped the world. Grabbing a notepad, he began to jot down a plan. First, improve his grades. Second, gather enough funds to start investing early. Third, avoid the mistakes he had made in his first life, especially the mistake of losing himself in someone else's life. In class, Ethan's transformation was subtle but noticeable. Teachers who had once dismissed him as average started calling on him more frequently. His peers, including Lily, seemed curious about his sudden focus and confidence. He caught her glancing at him from across the room during history class. He ignored her. That night, Ethan stayed up researching. With a cheap laptop and a slow internet connection, he began tracking early investment opportunities. Cryptocurrency, small tech startups, and even old collectibles. He remembered which ones would boom in value. Ethan's newfound focus didn't go unnoticed by Lily. She had always been sharp, though she masked it behind a layer of sarcasm and aloofness. Sitting a few rows behind him in class, she watched as he volunteered to answer a complex math problem. The old Ethan would have shrunk back, too busy scribbling notes to try and impress her. But now, he didn't even glance her way. At lunch, Ethan ate alone, something that wasn't entirely unusual. But what caught Lily's attention was the faint smirk on his face as he read a book on economics. The Ethan she knew had been predictable kind to a fault, always trying to include her in his plans. "Ethan, what's with the suit and tie?" Lily teased after class one day, leaning against the doorframe of the empty classroom. He turned, his expression unreadable. "It's called ambition, Lily. You should try it sometime." The words weren't rude, but the lack of warmth in his tone stunned her. Before she could retort, he had already walked past her, leaving her with a strange, unfamiliar feeling discomfort. Ethan's resolve didn't waver. He made polite conversation when necessary, but he refused to let Lily's presence dictate his actions. At a group study session, she tried to engage him. "So, Ethan, you're suddenly Mr. Perfect Student. What's next?" "World domination." "Something like that," he replied, not looking up from his notes. She frowned, annoyed by his nonchalance. "You're not fun anymore. Maybe I've realized that life isn't about being fun. It's about being meaningful." Her lips parted as if to retort, but the words didn't come. Instead, she crossed her arms, her usual confidence faltering. After the session, Ethan caught her watching him from across the library. He pretended not to notice. That night, as he reviewed his progress, Ethan felt a pang of doubt. He still loved Lily, but this distance, this barrier felt necessary. If she cared, she'd show it. And if she didn't, well, he wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, his mind buzzing with plans for the future. Lily's confusion and growing frustration were her problems now. This life was his, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers again. Ethan noticed her before she entered the library. Lily always had a certain energy, even when she wasn't speaking. He kept his eyes on his notebook, penning down plans for the week. She hovered near the doorway for a moment before finally walking in. It was the third time this week. She'd never been this interested in the library before. Back then, he would have felt a thrill at the idea of her noticing him, of her seeking him out. But now, he didn't know what to feel. He kept his head down as she approached, her steps purposeful, though there was a hint of hesitation in her movements. Finally, she stood across from him. "Why are you always here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Her tone was sharp, but her voice wavered just enough for him to catch it. "I like the quiet," Ethan replied evenly, refusing to let his emotions show. He didn't look up. "It's good for studying." "Studying? You've been acting weird lately," she said, her brow furrowing. "You're not chasing me anymore." The bluntness of her words hit him harder than he expected. Ethan's hand paused, his pen hovering over the notebook. He took a deep breath and set the pen down. "No, I'm not, he said, finally meeting her gaze. You don't like being chased, do you? She flinched, her lips pressing together as if she wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Instead, she straightened her posture, the sharpness returning to her voice. Whatever. Do what you want. She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving him in the suffocating quiet of the library. Ethan stared after her, his chest tight. Her words and actions contradicted each other. Why did she care if he wasn't chasing her? Why was she here at all? The next few weeks followed a pattern. Wherever Ethan went, whether it was the library, the gym, or even a cafe he'd just discovered, Lily seemed to show up. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, but the frequency was too high for that. She didn't always approach him, though. Sometimes, she'd sit at a table across the room, pretending to be engrossed in her phone or a book. Other times, she'd glance his way, her expression unreadable, before leaving without a word. The few times she did approach, their conversations always followed the same pattern: sharp words from her, calm but distant replies from him. It started to feel suffocating. She wasn't giving him space to breathe, to figure himself out. He'd spent so many years bending over backward for her, and now, when he was finally focusing on himself, she was everywhere. Why are you here? He finally asked one evening when she approached him at the gym. He kept his tone polite but firm. I'm allowed to be here, she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. You don't own this place. I didn't say I did, he replied, wiping the sweat off his forehead. But it feels like you're always showing up wherever I go. Is there a reason for that? Her eyes narrowed. Don't flatter yourself. You're not that important. Ethan forced a bitter laugh. Right. I'm not. He walked away before she could respond, heading to the locker room. Her words echoed in his mind, reopening old wounds he thought had healed. Later that night, Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the ceiling. The day's events replayed in his mind, especially the look in Lily's eyes when he walked away. For a moment, he thought he saw something other than irritation. Sadness, maybe. Regret. He shook his head. No, he couldn't afford to think that way. She'd spent their past life proving that he wasn't worth her time. Why would this life be any different? But then, why did he still care? He clenched his fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. He loved her, he always had. No matter how much he tried to convince himself otherwise, that love lingered like a stubborn flame. But he couldn't go back to being the man he used to be, the man who gave everything while receiving nothing in return. He'd promised himself he wouldn't let her take him for granted again. As much as it hurt, he resolved to keep his distance. Let her misunderstand him. Let her think he didn't care. It was better than falling back into the same toxic cycle. Meanwhile, across town, Lily sat alone in her room, staring at her phone. She wanted to call him, to demand an explanation for his behavior. But every time she thought about dialing his number, her fingers froze. Ethan sat on a park bench, his mind tangled in frustration and doubt. Despite his newfound success and independence, thoughts of Lily refused to leave him. He couldn't help but replay her contradictory behavior, the sharp words, the possessive actions. He felt more conflicted than ever, questioning his decisions. Just as he leaned back, a familiar voice cut through his thoughts. So, this is where you've been hiding. Ethan turned to see Lily standing a few feet away, her arms crossed but her expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. Her usual sharp demeanor seemed dulled, replaced by a subtle tremor in her voice. Why do you care? Ethan's tone was even, but his words carried an edge. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't retort like she usually would. Instead, she took a hesitant step forward. We need to talk. He wanted to refuse, but something in her eyes stopped him. Against his better judgment, he gestured for her to sit. The moment she did, her defenses crumbled. "Ethan," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I remember everything." Ethan stiffened. "What do you mean?" Lily's hands fidgeted in her lap as she confessed, "The life we had before, the kids, the marriage. I remember it all now. I don't know how or why, but I woke up one day, and it all came rushing back." His breath caught. He hadn't expected this. "I thought we were happy," she continued, her voice cracking. You said you felt unloved, unappreciated. But that wasn't true, Ethan. I loved you." "Then why didn't you ever say it?" he interrupted, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why did I have to spend my entire life wondering if I mattered to you?" Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. "Because I didn't know how to say it. I thought you knew. I thought my actions were enough." Lily's voice grew steadier as she continued, "Ethan, I'm not like you. I've always been awkward with emotions. Words don't come easily to me. But I thought you understood that. When I married you, when I let you into my life, into my bed, I thought you knew how much you meant to me. I never let anyone else in like that. Never." Ethan wanted to speak, but her words stopped him. "I didn't have friends, Ethan," she admitted, her tone filled with a lifetime of regret. "Not real ones. People only wanted to be near me because of my family's money, or because they thought they could use me. But you were different. You stayed, no matter how sharp my words were, no matter how many walls I put up." Her voice cracked again as tears streamed down her face. "You were the only person who ever made me feel safe, who made me believe that I could be loved for who I am. And I ruined it?" Ethan felt his chest tighten as her confession sank in. He thought back to their past life, the small gifts she'd given him after harsh arguments, the way she'd always supported his dreams in her own quiet way. He'd dismissed those gestures as guilt, but now he saw them for what they were, her way of showing love. "I thought we were a happy family," she whispered. "I thought, if I wasn't saying enough, I could show it. I didn't realize I was hurting you, Ethan. I didn't realize how much you needed to hear the words." Ethan felt a lump in his throat as memories of their life together flooded back, the warmth in her touch, the quiet nights they spent together, the way she always seemed to know what he needed before he did. "But you never said anything," she continued. "You never told me it wasn't enough. You just left." Her words cut deep, and Ethan couldn't deny the truth in them. He'd been so consumed by his own pain that he hadn't considered hers. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice hoarse. "I should have told you. I should have been more patient. But Lily, I thought you didn't care." She shook her head vehemently. "I cared more than you'll ever know. And if I have to spend the rest of this life proving it to you, I will." Ethan felt a surge of emotion as he looked at her. For the first time, he saw her not as the sharp-tongued girl who hurt him, but as someone who had been just as lost and scared as he was. "Lily," he reached out, his hand covering hers. "We both made mistakes. But if we're going to do this, we have to do it together. No more misunderstandings. No more silence." Lily paced around the house nervously, her hands fumbling with the hem of her blouse. Ethan had always been patient with her, but she knew she had caused him pain over the years with her sharp words and her inability to express affection properly. She had learned so much about herself since their argument, since the confession that had shattered her walls. It wasn't easy to change. The sharpness, the defenses she had built over years of distrust, didn't just vanish overnight. But she was trying. Lily glanced at Ethan as he sat on the couch, immersed in his work. She took a deep breath and walked over, standing hesitantly in front of him. I made lunch today," she said softly, holding out the small plate she had prepared for him. Her hands were trembling slightly, but she did her best to smile. She could see the curiosity in his eyes, but he didn't immediately respond with a teasing comment or a sharp remark like he usually would. Instead, Ethan set his papers aside and gave her a soft, genuine smile. "You did? Thank you, Lily." He took the plate from her, his fingers brushing hers gently. Lily could feel her heart flutter slightly. It was small, this effort, but it meant everything. "You're welcome," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But she wasn't finished. She could feel the weight of the moment in her chest. And then, despite herself, her Tsunderside took over. "Don't get used to it or anything. It's not like I did it because I care or anything," she blurted out, immediately regretting her words. But before she could retreat into her old, defensive self, she heard him laugh softly. "Of course, you don't. I totally believe you." Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, but Ethan didn't let her retreat. "But you're making an effort, and that's what matters. Even when you try to push it away with your words." His voice was gentle, understanding, but there was a playful glint in his eyes. Lily sighed, frustrated with herself. "I'm sorry," she muttered. I'm trying, Ethan. I really am. I just don't know how to say the things that I feel without sounding harsh." Ethan stood up and took a step toward her, cupping her face gently with his hands. "You don't have to be perfect, Lily. But you have to try. And that's all I've ever wanted from you. To try." As the days passed, Lily made more of an effort to show Ethan that she was changing. Small gestures, like leaving sweet notes for him in the morning or taking a break from her hectic schedule to spend time with him, became a part of their routine. There were moments when she slipped, her old habits creeping in with a sharp comment or a joke that hid the softness of her heart. But she would quickly apologize, realizing her mistake before he could even be hurt by it. Ethan, now more patient and understanding, would simply smile and tease her lightly, knowing the difference between when she was being serious and when her tsundere side had taken over. "You're really cute when you do that, you know," he would say, with a grin that melted the tension in her chest. "Shut up," she'd reply, though the softness in her eyes betrayed her. "You know I don't need your compliments." But this time, Ethan didn't take the bait. Instead, he pulled her into a hug, and Lily allowed herself to sink into the warmth of his embrace. "You don't need to be perfect, Lily. But you're perfect for me." And for the first time in what felt like years, Lily allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth being loved this way. Ethan's love wasn't about expectations. It wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance, even when she wasn't sure she could accept herself. Lily sat in the living room, her head resting against Ethan's chest. The weight of the future lingered on her mind. Things had changed between them, but there were still so many steps to take. She had to stabilize her position at the company, establish herself as the woman she was capable of being, strong, independent, and capable of balancing her career with her family life. But she didn't want to wait forever. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply as she felt Ethan's steady heartbeat beneath her. There was still so much to be done. But for the first time in a long while, she felt hope. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think I was unloving to our child too?" She asked the question timidly, afraid of the answer, but knowing it was a necessary one. Ethan's hand stilled on her back, and he sighed deeply. "Lily, no one is perfect. You've had your struggles, but it doesn't mean you haven't loved our child. It just means you didn't know how to show it. But now I see you tried. And that's enough." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. She never realized how much her words, sharp, dismissive, or cold, could hurt those she loved most. "I didn't mean to hurt them. I didn't mean to hurt you. I don't know when I became like this. I don't know when I stopped thinking before I spoke. Why didn't anyone tell me I was hurting them? Ethan just listened, letting her speak, knowing that sometimes, all she needed was someone to hear her. God gave us a second chance, Lily, he said gently. And this time, we're not going to waste it. We'll build something better, something stronger. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I won't regret it. I almost lost everything. I won't let that happen again. First, I'll stabilize my position at the company, then we'll marry. I'll love you, Ethan, and I'll love our children with everything I have. She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. I'll never let them feel unloved. Not again. Ethan held her close, his arms wrapping around her tighter. We'll do it together, Lily. And we'll make sure that our children grow up knowing how much they're loved. They sat together in silence, but it was a comfortable silence. A peaceful one. A silence filled with the understanding that their journey together was far from over. But this time, it would be different. This time, they would do it right.